Ed, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with CCEF?
Thanks for asking. I've been at CCF since 1981. So prior to that time, it was doing. I think it started around 4 or 5 years before that. And when I came, I was working in the doctor of ministry program and doing counseling, and that still is my own primary emphasis. It's teaching and counseling here.
How would you define biblical counseling? What exactly is biblical counseling?
Biblical counseling has two strands, and Jay Adams represented one, and a lesser known person, but certainly influential in my own life, was John Bettler. He was the executive director at CCEF. So John, they were friends. John oversaw CCEF. Jay made NANC, National Association of Nuthetic Counselors, which is now the ACBC. It became his primary area of concentration. And so CCF always had a different ethos. It was reformed, and I guess the question is, what does reform mean? It can have all kinds of different things. Mean all kinds of different things. But my own understanding of reform is that it should sound really good. It's God's grace to undeserving people who tend to turn the other direction. So all ministry should sound good. I guess the other feature is that we live in the age of the Spirit, and in the Old Testament, you tried to establish walls between yourself and people who were different than yourself, because you were going to become them at the first conversation. But in the New Testament, there seems to be just a stabler spiritual foundation, and so there's this movement outward, and so I think CCF always had that how do we engage the world around us, and that certainly includes secular psychotherapy, but it includes medicine and neuropsychology and all kinds of other disciplines that live on our borders. So it's probably worthwhile for people to realize that it's two different groups, and my experience with those who would identify themselves as integrationists, as they think about it, is really one group where Jay Adams was the father of all things.
What exactly does CCEF do?
CCF overall, we simply want to do everything better than we've been doing it, and we have this scripture, that this amazing job description, where what are the struggles in daily life that have always been there and also are emerging in a new way today. What are those struggles, and how can the Word of Christ speak really meaningfully to those? That's where we live every day, and at least from my perspective, it's been a humbling job description to be able to have done that full time for almost 35 years now. So that's what we do here at CCF. That's still what drives us. I think for me, what drives me is how can we take biblical counseling, the care of souls, pastoral care, counseling, whatever we want to call it. And I think the words are probably relevant because they identify a certain emphasis. But how can we take that and make it highly accessible to people who are not professionals in the context of the church? I think of Ephesians chapter 4, where Ephesians chapter 4 seems to be saying that pastors are really the trainers of their congregation, so the congregation can do the heavy lifting of ministry, and certainly that day-to-day care of souls is a huge task within our local churches. So one of my desires is how can we take material and make it so people in the church say, "Oh, I can do that. I can say those things. I can move toward another person, and I can pray those kinds of ways." So how can counseling be much more accessible? Which it's my own experience with learning anything is it's a mess. And it's this motley group of pieces, and then the pieces begin to come together, and you begin to see sort of this coherent whole.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have a coherent whole, then the prize part of it is how do you make that coherent whole available to the world. And I was just watching a physics professor at MIT on YouTube the other day, and he was a master teacher, and he was making MIT physics available to the entire world. And I ended up listening to these fascinating lectures on pendulums, which have no particular impact on my own daily ministry, but you could see here's a guy who knew this complex material, but he was able to make it accessible to everyone. So that's certainly our desire at CCF, and it's my particular desire. But at the same time, how can we recognize that Scripture brings a sophistication and an appreciation for the complexity of humanity and the complexity of human problems? So I guess the question there is how do we engage the corpus of modern psychiatry and the various diagnoses within modern psychiatry? How can we both have that lay emphasis, but continue to show Scripture's breadth and depth? So I think that's largely my mission, and it's largely CCF's mission.
Ed, can you tell us a little bit about what biblical counseling does? What happens in a biblical counseling session, and how does it help people?
When I look at the people I've had opportunities to spend time with over the years, those who have done best are people who have been embedded in the community, in a community that's not necessarily an expert community, but a community that loves them. When they don't understand something, they're patient and they try to understand it. A community that prays for them, and a community that's just persistently engaged in their lives. Those are the people I found who have done best. You gather wisdom over time as you see how life works, how people work. So Scripture doesn't demean that. Yet at the same time, Scripture really prizes just ordinary people and how the Lord uses really ordinary and, I guess to use Paul's term, weak people to do really magnificent things in ministry. So that's always going on in the context of the church, and it has been going on in the context of the church throughout New Testament history.
And what are your thoughts on current discipleship movements in the church? How effective are they? What kinds of strengths do you notice? What kinds of areas of need do you notice?
Sometimes the discipleship material that I find, it doesn't seem to engage everyday life. It tends to be more theological training and biblical training, which is really important. But biblical and theological training does not necessarily immediately force its way into everyday life. And sometimes I find in my own experience is I have, the times I have grown theologically, sometimes what I've found is the theological category will say, will take root in my life and I'll say, this is great, I just love this. And then 3 years later, it will work its way out in a comment that I made to my wife or a way that I prayed. It takes time for biblical doctrine to become part of us. So it shapes the way we view ourselves and view the world. And so it's not an automatic process. So I do find that some discipling packages don't seem to force it's all this is an expression of love. What does it look like in this situation? What does it look like in this situation? So we can always do discipleship better. That would be one thing that I would say. I would say another thing is people are gun shy with trying to help each other in the midst of personal problems because I think for two reasons. One is they have this sense that they're partitioned from them because this is for the professionals. And so I certainly find that and then coupled with that, people are busy and to engage with each other in the challenges of life, it just takes time and people don't feel like they have the time. So you put those two things together, people feeling less competent to be able to help, and not feeling not like to have a whole lot of time to help, it does suggest that people are struggling on their own with these things, and the church doesn't quite know how to mobilize us as we move toward each other. So I'm trying to be respectful of the history of the church and say
Right.
there's a strong history of elegant pastoral care. It's really quite sophisticated. It's aware of sort of this intersection of the human soul and the human body, and even though they didn't have an appreciation of neuropsychology until the last 40, 50 years or so, there is an implicit appreciation for things the body can do when it's not functioning well. So I want to make it clear that the church has done that throughout its history. But there are certain unique features of this moment that make the enterprise of having Scripture become lively with the daily challenges of life. It becomes even more important.
Can you talk a little bit about similarities and differences then between biblical counseling, like that you guys do at CCEF, and nouthetic counseling?
I would say that nouthetic counseling and biblical counseling, as you can tell by the name change from nouthetic to biblical, there really is there is a desire to merge more and more. Yet there are differences, and one of the fun challenges that we have, and which is part of your symposium, is where do we agree and what are the differences? I find that it's just plain hard to identify the differences. It's challenging work. You have to know somebody fairly well, and obviously the goal is when we identify the differences, the differences we're identifying, people in the other group would say, yeah, that sounds about right. That's challenging work. So I would say that there have been differences, certainly with biblical and nouthetic counseling, and they probably still linger in some way. And I would say that they come in perhaps three forms. One would be, and these are related. Jay Adams' material was, I can remember when I read Competent to Counsel, my understanding, it was really invigorating to me because I read it a long time ago, and when it first came out, and it was bringing Scripture to the details of life, which for some reason I hadn't seen done yet, and maybe I was just asleep on all those sermons, but it really felt fresh to me. Number one, it also seemed to be saying that we all should be doing this. But that was that on the second issue, we all should be doing that. That was really an inaccurate understanding of what Jay was saying. When Jay was talking about competent to counsel, he was talking about the ordained minister as being competent to counsel, and so that's one difference. The issues of authority seem to be very important matters in nouthetic counseling, in ministerial authority, and my own sense of that is there are a couple of things coming together. It's what does it mean to be a minister, a professional ordained minister, and what does ministerial authority mean? That's one. I think the other is that Jay was envisioning, if counseling would go on for more than a couple sessions, he was envisioning a fairly recalcitrant person who was on the cusp of being disciplined. And when you view that as the group he's identifying in part, his material makes a little bit more sense. You can understand why there'd be an urgency and a real focus on sin. But so what am I saying? I'm saying that Jay is identifying an office of the ordained person, and in biblical counseling, I would think more we're little p pastors rather than big P pastors. We do pastoral care of the soul, but we're doing it as children, as fathers, as mothers, as friends with one another. And the pastoral part is not so much the ordination of being a pastor; it's the we care about the long term. We are interested in long term care of one another. That's the pastoral feature. So the person who does it would be one difference. The audience would be another, which would mean the prominent metaphors would be different. I think that the prominent metaphor in nouthetic counseling seems to be overall a teaching metaphor, sometimes almost a medical metaphor, a physician who comes in and makes the diagnosis and gives the treatment. And I would say, at least for me in biblical counseling, the metaphor is, I realize this is a bit hackneyed, but I always come back to it. It's people walking together. This is, the idea of a journey is a fairly significant image in Scripture, and the idea of we are walking with Christ, with one another, because of Christ with one another, and to Christ with one another, and so that image would, you're going to say things very differently given that particular image. So those would be some of the issues. I think another one would be, nouthetic counseling had a view of sanctification, which is different than I'd understand. I wrote an article on this at one point, and it was trying to understand how J. Adams' material viewed sanctification and the nature of sin. And see if I can do this very briefly.
Okay.
As I understood it, Jay was talking about sin as almost etched neuronally in our brains. And he was using the word sarx, the word for flesh, as the connection, that sin is embedded in our very sarx. And so the treatment is you rehabituate yourself. You do the right thing over and over again, and it makes some kind, almost like repatterning. People talk about children repatterning their brain in different ways, and you can see how that would lend itself to something a bit more behavioristic, where you do the right thing and you persistently do it until the brain patterns have been realigned. So there does seem to be that kind of background embedded in the theology of nouthetic counseling, and I would suggest that sanctification is this wonderfully motley process, but what is key in that sanctification is that we are turning to a person. We're turning to a person. We're turning to a person. So you can see how those two emphases within sanctification would lead to very different kinds of conversations, where one would be much more personal. Who is this God that we follow, and why are we reluctant to follow him, and what is the mythology that we must carry around as to who he is? It leads to those kinds of questions, where the other would be, here's what are the three things we're going to be doing this week, and we're going to do it, and we're just going to keep doing it and doing it.
In your opinion, Ed, then what are differences that you see between biblical counseling, like CCEF does, and professional Christian counseling?
There are differences. There are Christians who do counseling, and there's this, when we talk to each other, we know we're brothers and sisters, but we're saying things differently, and there are reasons for those differences, and it's hard work to identify those things. And one of my own desires in being together with you at this forum is to think about, well, where are those differences? And because I think in the past the differences have largely been perceived as some people integrate and some people don't integrate,
right.
And that's just, I've never found that to be very useful, because I think that the larger common ground is that sometimes secular psychotherapeutic literature is very intriguing, and sometimes it's not, and the process is a process of discernment. I think ultimately, most of us would say something like that, and we might say it a little bit differently. I guess my own sense is the actual issue of integration and our stance towards secular psychotherapy, that's probably not where the action is. And if that's not where the action is, then where is the action?
Yeah.
Where might be the differences?
We feel like this get together with all of you guys is really important and essential to kind of facilitate dialogue between these different streams and to model how to relate to each other, to others in the community. What is the importance of a symposium like this?
To me, the real beauty of what you're doing is you're just bringing live people together, and and I hope this doesn't seem too minimalist, but sometimes I've thought that if I go to a place where people have certain stereotypes of biblical counseling, all I have to do is be a regular sinner, and it will disarm their stereotypes. As long as I don't yell and scream and hit people, then oh, hey, Welch he's like okay, he's a normal guy.
Exactly.
I think those kinds of things are so significant to. I guess the key is how do we, in a time when we're all busy, how can we be face to face?
Yep.
Because even with you, if anybody talks about you, I'm just making this up.
Sure.
But I will defend you now because we're just going to be we just tend to be more charitable as we have actually had a conversation with another person.
And just on a practical side, what is it in counseling that really helps people?
Do I love and like the people that I'm speaking with? So the first is, do I love? What do I mean by that? Do I really care for them? Am I merely a consultant, or have they wiggled their way into my own heart in some way? So that would be one. Do I like them? Do I see good in them? If my own experience is, if I'm having a hard time liking somebody, then I am not going to be very helpful to that person. I guess the third variation of that would be, am I open with that person? If I am thinking all kinds of things about somebody, but I'm reluctant to speak them for various reasons, my own fears of what they might think of me would be one, but perhaps not the dominant one. It would be, will I be able to continue in a relationship with them if I speak these things more openly to them? But I would say that loving, i.e. liking, i.e. a normal Christian relationship where we can speak openly with one another. If those factors aren't part of my counseling with somebody, then I might as well just go home because it's not going to go anywhere. So yeah, and that's what the secular community has observed for decades, and I guess our response should be, well, of course, yeah, that's the way the universe is constructed. That's the way the Lord has determined how relationships and people work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's our delight. It would be, at least I personally would find it to be very boring to be a helping technician, where somebody came in and they spelled out the problem, and I said, okay, here are the 10 things you need to do, and okay, next person. That would be, that would just sounds horrible. So.
Ed, can you talk a little bit about your perspective on the needs of counselor trainees? What sorts of unique issues are you bumping into in terms of personal needs, maybe areas of personal brokenness, or even professional training needs in the students that you guys are training right now?
I find that our seminary students, my guess is that they're more involved in pornography and gaming than today than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I don't know the statistics on that within the group that I work with, but I suspect it's tragically high. I would guess it's certainly well over half are involved in pornography and in gaming. And how do we create a context where they can speak openly about those kinds of things? do something with it before they're involved in ministry situations where there's a greater price to pay if they're willing to be open. So what do I find? I find that the ways of the world, we find them in our students.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of our constituencies. Another constituency is an online constituency. They tend to be older, and they're people who they're pastors many times, or they are just really, really wise lay people who are involved in other people's lives, and they want help with that. When I hear from those students, I think the church is in really, really good hands. And these are not necessarily professionals. They're some of the women, they might not have particular jobs, so they can be doing this kind of ministry a lot in their church. For the men, it's they oftentimes will have another job, but to see the humility, the love for Jesus, and the sacrificial love for other people. So in that sense, I feel like I can die today and be real happy with what's happening in the church. I'll identify one other group. The other group would be our seminary students who are aiming for licensure, and I'm going to leave it to you to sharpen me on that one. I guess my concern is that they are moving into a secular environment, and they're not going to have anybody who's really thinking with them biblically about some of the situations that they're working with, and to really think biblically about a non-Christian is harder work than thinking biblically about a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's as if we have to know Scripture a whole lot better to be able to speak meaningfully to a non-Christian. Because, in part because so much of our understanding of truth is embedded in particular vocabulary that's sometimes a technical vocabulary, and it takes years to finally work our way up to the ordinary vocabulary that Scripture tends to use. So I think our concern with those who have moved toward licensure and are going to be probably working in secular situations is that they sort of lose their chops for thinking biblically because they're just not challenged to do that. And I think most of them have a sense that, well, even if they did think biblically, they couldn't do it anyway.
And like the last question, in your opinion, from a biblical counselor's perspective, what kinds of needs do you see or are you concerned about in professional Christian counselors?
Ongoing supervision for people who are involved in secular settings who want to continue to think biblically, rather than just say, we'll see you later and we'll move on to the next group of students. So we're presently forming those, and we're forming those for graduate students, people going on for Ph.D.s in secular situations, and how can they have a monthly supervisory group to talk about issues that come up in classes, to talk about different counseling situations. And essentially, what I see with our students is that gradually this partition emerges, and the partition is here's Scripture, and here's my everyday work in this secular environment. And I think initially it's this very permeable boundary where their desire is that Scripture really infuses everything. It's just sort of it's what we want to be as Christians. We want our Christian understanding of life and people and relationships to go everywhere. But I think what we find is it eventually ends up becoming a partition where the Scripture is for their own personal godliness, and then for their actual helping, they default to a cognitive model, which tends to be the flavor of the decade, I guess.
Ed, to you, where are things headed in the future? Where do you see things going in regards to these three streams that are represented by you and Mark and Eric at the symposium? Where's this all headed, and what do you see future counselors needing in order to be able to be successful in the future?
It's only been in the last year that we have we have put words on it more clearly. And just like anything else, until you have words for it, you're not going to be able to do much with it.
Right.
So we've recognized that we have not served our students well, who have gone toward a licensure direction, and now what is it? It's us pursuing those we've had personal relationships with, and really trying to be mentors, but recognizing their limitations in our time, and so presently we're just trying to devise the technology and the marketing to let our students know here's what we're going to be doing, and some of it could be simply webinars. People could be presenting cases or questions, and for a faculty person to muse. Here's how I would think about that biblically. That's where we're headed presently. It sounds like we share an interest in. Maybe I'll put it this way: that what I find is that it's so many of our students. Now, we wouldn't call ourselves integrationists,
Right.
but if we're talking to another group, we would, because we and the imagery of integration is sort of these two things sort of working nicely and symbiotically, but that's just a limitation of the word. Most Christians will approach it. Scripture, it brings, it's revelation. It tells us things we would never know otherwise. Not to mention, it's the very mind of God, so it does have this primacy. So I think we would all say those things, but I think what I observe is that people in secular settings, they're no longer integrationists. You don't see how they work together. They're just plain old secularists. They're really nice, but the people who aren't Christians are really nice too, and they love. But people who aren't Christians, therapists, they love pretty well, and they're sacrificial, and so that's, it seems to me that's our question. How we don't want to forsake the secular arena, but how can we? Perhaps it's a similar question to what Christian teachers in the public setting would be asking. How can we be distinctly, uniquely Christian? How can we function out of a calling? How can we be functioning as missionaries into this particular setting? We believe that God has called us here. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So I think our challenge is a little bit greater because our topic is so near and dear to the very center of Scripture. Who are we? Where are we going? And how do we get there? And what's life all about? A class on chemistry is not going to engage some of those issues in quite the same way. As things should go, old categories they morph, and the landscape changes, and at some point the landscape changes in such a way that we probably need different terms. But I guess I'm not really that interested in terms. And going back to your own counseling work, I see all kinds of people with psychiatric diagnoses, but on one hand, it really does. It's helpful. It sure just shows me, the constellation of issues. But once I get to know them for 10 minutes, I just don't think of terms. I think of the person. So anyway, that as a result, I leave it to better minds like Eric's to throw around some terms that can identify these emerging groups. Yeah. I think for me, it's more the very things that we're talking about right now. Who are the people who can represent the sort of this mutating spectrum, and how can we have conversations where we know, in a sense, the infrastructure of somebody's work, the sort of the personal and theological guts to it, and there we see what's the one place that is most profitable for dialogue, rather than 3 or 4. To me, I think I find myself a little bit more interested in that. With the integration question per se, Eric obviously has a great deal of interest in careful psychology, and we're all interested in that. I think some of my frustration with the integration question is we've spoken oftentimes theoretically about and abstractly about the process of integration, and I think there has been there's been real fruit to that where we want to be discerning. We want to be discerning. We recognize we're aware enough of worldviews and postmodernism and psychotherapy has its own particular worldview, and so we want to be discerning. So it seems to me that's where the last 20 years of the integrationist discussion have taken us. Sometimes I think I find myself a little bit more interested in asking what would be one study that you find to be so critical that if I'm not aware of that study, somehow I'm not serving people very well. To try to have, that's integration, that's a much more concrete version of the integration discussion. I don't think those are the kinds of things they're hard to do in the context of a textbook, but I think those would be useful. And when Eric talks, I find myself, let's take one piece of that good psychology and let's see how we would work with it together from the different perspectives that we have.
Ed, to you, where are things headed in the future? Where do you see things going in regards to these three streams that are represented by you and Mark and Eric at the symposium? Where's this all headed, and what do you see future counselors needing in order to be able to be successful in the future?
What would be the next generation of dialogue that builds on the work of previous generations, but recognize we are in a different time now, and how can we engage with each other, recognizing our time limitations? How can we engage with each other with shorter materials, even blog kinds of materials,
right?
That would be less work than a 5 views kind of volume, but it could also be more dynamic because you don't have to wait a year or two to respond to something. So, so I'll be looking forward to your thoughts too at the end of our time together to see what you have up your sleeve for new ways to dialogue.
Ed, I really want to thank you today for offering this information to us, and I'm looking really forward to having you join us here in Portland and to interact with Mark and with Eric and just share some of your perspectives from your point of view. I think you offer a really important perspective at the table, and I have a feeling a lot of us, biblical counselors as well as all the other counselors who will be there, will benefit a lot from what you have to offer.
You're very kind. My own heart is that I really value the kinds of things that you're doing, but I don't think of ways to actually get it done myself. So I so value that you're not only thinking about these things, but you're actually creating a forum at a certain amount of expense to do that. So thank you very much for it, Ken.